Are you Mara Villanueva?
Yes. Did something happen to the boy I fed last night?
The young man you fed last night was my son. And for 8 months, I couldn't reach him. Until you did.
Rain had a way of making the Blue Sparrow Café feel smaller than it was, the windows fogged from the espresso machine, the smell of cinnamon and wet coats thick in the air. Mara Villanueva liked it this way. Slow nights meant she could breathe. She was 29, and she had built this café out of a failed marriage and a small inheritance from a grandmother who never once told her she'd amount to much. The apron she wore had a coffee stain shaped like Ohio on the left pocket. She'd stopped trying to scrub it out months ago. At 9:40 p.m., the bell above the door rang, and a soldier walked in. He was young, younger than his posture suggested, maybe 24, in a fatigue jacket damp at the shoulders, his boots leaving faint prints on the tile. He sat at the corner table, the one beneath the flickering light Mara kept meaning to fix. He ordered black coffee and the cheapest sandwich on the menu, counting out crumpled bills like each one cost him something to let go of. She noticed his hands shook slightly when he lifted the cup. She noticed he flinched when the espresso machine hissed, just for a fraction of a second, like his body remembered something his face was trying to forget. She noticed he ate alone, and that no one, not one person in 3 hours, called to check on him. She noticed, too, the small things that told a longer story than his silence did. The way he'd angled his chair before sitting, so his back met the wall and his eyes met the door. Not a habit, a necessity, the kind of positioning a body learns and never unlearns. The way he unfolded his napkin and refolded it twice before using it, hands needing something to organize. The way his eyes tracked the room every time the bell above the door rang, cataloging each new arrival before returning to his plate, then doing it again for the next person, and the next. An exhausting vigilance he probably didn't register anymore as effort. When the couple 2 tables over laughed too loudly at something on a phone screen, he didn't jump, exactly, but his fork paused mid-air for a beat too long, and his jaw tightened, and it took him a visible few seconds to unclench it again. Mara had grown up around silence like that. Her father had come back from something he never named, and he'd sat in kitchens just like this one, flinching at sounds that weren't there, always choosing the chair that faced the door, always going quiet in restaurants the way this boy was going quiet now. She recognized the specific weather of a person carrying more than they were saying, not sadness exactly, something closer to a held breath that had lasted 8 months. She almost approached him twice before she worked up the nerve, wiping down a table that didn't need wiping, refilling a napkin dispenser that was already full, buying herself time to decide what, if anything, she owed a stranger who hadn't asked her for a thing. When he came to pay, she'd already decided. "It's on the house tonight," she said, sliding the check away before he could reach for it. He looked up, surprised, wary, the way people are when kindness arrives without a transaction attached. "You don't have to do that, ma'am." "I know," she said. "That's why I'm doing it." He didn't argue further. He just nodded, said, "Thank you," in a voice that seemed unused to saying it, and left into the rain. She didn't ask his name. She didn't need to. It wasn't about him, not really. It was about every version of her father she'd ever wanted to feed and couldn't reach. She locked up at 11, tired in the particular way of someone who'd been standing 12 hours, and didn't think about the soldier again until she was drifting to sleep, wondering, distantly, if he'd made it wherever he was going. She woke to her phone buzzing against the nightstand, then buzzing again, then a third time, until she gave up pretending she could ignore it. It was Denny, her line cook, and his voice had the particular pitch of someone standing in the middle of something he didn't understand. "Mara, you need to get down here. Like, now." "What's wrong? Did the pipes—" "There's Humvees," he said. "There's like 6 Humvees parked outside the cafe. There's soldiers everywhere. I think they're waiting for you. She sat up so fast the room tilted. Denny, is this a joke? I've got eyes on it right now. I'm not joking. Mara, what did you do? She didn't have an answer. She hadn't done anything except give a stranger a free sandwich. But some small, cold part of her, the part shaped by a father who'd taught her that silence could mean danger long before it meant peace, understood, even before she reached the cafe, that this was not going to be a small thing. She threw on yesterday's jeans and drove faster than she should have, gripping a steering wheel that suddenly felt too thin to hold on to. The first thing she saw, turning onto Meridian Street, was the flashing lights. Not police, not ambulance, but something more organized, more deliberate. Military vehicles lined the curb in a formation that looked less like an accident and more like an operation. A dozen soldiers stood near the entrance of her cafe in dress uniform, backs straight, faces unreadable, and standing at the front of them, waiting specifically for her, was a woman in her 50s with silver-streaked hair pulled into a severe bun and 3 stars on her shoulder. Mara parked crookedly, forgot to close her car door, and walked toward the small crowd with her heart lodged somewhere near her throat. "Ma'am," the woman said, stepping forward. "Are you Mara Villanueva?" "Yes." Her voice came out smaller than she wanted. "Is something wrong? Is this about the boy who came in last night?" Something shifted in the general's face. Not anger, not accusation, but something closer to restrained emotion. The kind a person spends a career learning to control. "Ma'am," she said again, "my name is General Adele Kess. The young man you fed last night was my son." Mara's first instinct was to apologize, though she didn't know for what. "I didn't know he was... I didn't ask his name. I know," General Kess said. "That's precisely why we're here." She gestured, and a soldier stepped forward holding a slim folder, the kind used for official reports, edges crisp and squared. Kess didn't take it. She simply nodded toward it, as though she needed a moment before she could speak about what it contained. "My son is Corporal Eli Kess," she said. "2 tours. The last one ended badly. I won't detail it here, but I'll tell you this. He came home 8 months ago, and he hasn't said more than 100 words to me since." Mara felt something twist behind her ribs. She thought of the way he'd flinched at the espresso machine, the way his hands had shaken around the coffee cup, the way he'd eaten like a man, trying not to be noticed. 8 months, Kess continued, and he hasn't gone anywhere. Not the grocery store, not his sister's wedding, not the VA appointments he's supposed to attend. He sits in his apartment, and when I visit, he watches television with the sound off so he doesn't have to explain why loud noises make him leave the room. She looked at Mara directly now, and there was something raw beneath the discipline in her eyes. "Last night he called me. For the first time in 5 weeks he called me, and he said..." Her voice caught, just slightly, just enough for Mara to understand what this cost her to say aloud in front of her own soldiers. He said, "Mom, there's still good people. I forgot that." The cafe had gone entirely silent. Denny stood frozen behind the counter, still holding a rag he'd forgotten he was using. A woman by the window had lowered her phone mid-scroll. "He told me about a stranger who paid for his dinner and didn't ask him anything, who didn't look at him like he was broken, who didn't need him to explain himself to deserve a sandwich." Kess exhaled slowly. "Ma'am, I have watched my son survive things I am not permitted to describe to civilians. I have watched him come home and disappear into a version of silence I could not reach, no matter what I tried. And you reached him in 4 minutes with a free sandwich." Mara's throat tightened. "I didn't do anything special. I just saw someone who needed..." "You saw him," Kess said, cutting gently through the deflection. "That's the thing nobody's done in 8 months. Everyone else sees a diagnosis, a liability, a soldier who needs managing. You saw a person eating alone in the rain, and you treated him like one. Later, When the initial shock had settled into something more like disbelief, Mara learned the full context, piece by piece, the way General Kess offered it. Carefully, like handing over something breakable. Eli hadn't just gone quiet from combat stress, though that was part of it. He'd lost 2 men in his unit during an ambush his last deployment, men he'd trained alongside for 3 years, men whose names he still wouldn't say aloud. He'd made a decision in the field, a defensible one, tactically correct, the kind reviewed and cleared by every board that examined it, that had nonetheless meant someone lived and someone didn't, and he carried the weight of that division like a physical thing lodged behind his sternum. He didn't talk about it because talking made him relive choosing. He'd come home to a mother who loved him fiercely and didn't know how to reach him, a sister getting married to a man Eli had never properly met because he couldn't make himself attend the engagement dinner, and an apartment that had become less a home than a container for a person trying to disappear quietly. "I've tried therapists," Kess admitted. "Good ones." He goes. He sits. He says almost nothing, and then he comes home and goes quieter for a week after. I've tried bringing him to family things. He leaves after 10 minutes, always with some excuse about needing air. I've watched my son turn into someone I recognize physically and don't recognize at all otherwise. "So why the Humvees?" Mara finally asked, gesturing at the small fleet outside her window. "Why all of—" She gestured vaguely at the assembled soldiers. This? For the first time, something like embarrassment crossed the general's face. "That," she said, "was largely my doing, and I'll admit it was disproportionate. When he called me last night, really called, really spoke, for the first time in weeks, I didn't know what to do with the feeling. I wanted to see the place. I wanted to see the person. And when a 3-star general wants to visit an address at 7 a.m., certain protocols simply activate themselves whether she intends them to or not." Despite everything, Mara felt something in her chest loosen slightly. The particular relief of finding out that the terrifying thing was, underneath, just a mother who loved her son too much to wait for an appropriate hour. "I'm not in trouble," Mara said slowly. "You are the furthest thing from trouble," Kess said. "You are, as far as I'm concerned, the first person who's helped him make progress in 8 months. I came here to thank you in person. The vehicles were, poor judgment on my part, born of urgency." Denny, from behind the counter, muttered, "This is the best shift I've ever worked," and nobody had the heart to tell him to be quiet. Eli didn't come that day, or the next. Mara found herself watching the corner table more than she meant to, the one under the flickering light, half expecting and half dreading his return. She told herself it wasn't personal, that she'd have wondered about any regular who vanished mid-story, but some part of her, the part shaped by a father whose silences she'd never fully learned to interpret, wanted, badly, for this one to have a different ending. He came in on the 4th day, at the same hour, in the same jacket, and this time he didn't sit at the corner table. He walked to the counter instead. "I heard my mother came here," he said. It wasn't quite an apology, but it carried the shape of one. "She did." Mara wiped her hands on her apron, unsure what tone to take. With some backup, a flicker of something almost like a smile crossed his face. Gone as quickly as it arrived, but real. That's her. Overcorrects. Always has. He looked at the counter, at his hands, anywhere but Mara's face. "I wanted to say thank you, for the sandwich, and for not asking anything. Everyone asks. My mom asks. My therapist asks. My sister keeps asking if I'm doing better, like it's a test I'm failing. I didn't ask because it wasn't my business," Mara said simply. "You looked like someone who needed a meal and a minute of not being interrogated. That's not complicated. That's just Tuesday. It's not Tuesday, though." His voice was quiet. "It hasn't been an ordinary anything in 8 months." Mara considered him for a moment, the tension in his shoulders, the way his eyes kept sliding toward the door as though tracking an exit even at rest. She recognized the posture. Her father had held rooms the same way, always positioned near a way out, always aware of the exits before he was aware of the conversation. "You don't have to talk about any of it," she said, "but you're welcome to sit. Coffee's on me again, if you want it, no conditions." He sat, not at the corner table this time, but at the counter itself, close enough that conversation would happen whether either of them planned it. They didn't talk about the war, she didn't ask, and he didn't offer. Instead, they talked about small things. The espresso machine's temperamental pressure valve, a book he'd started 3 times and never finished. The fact that Denny's playlist consisted entirely of songs from before either of them was born. It was, on its surface, nothing. But Mara understood, watching his shoulders slowly ease down from his ears over the course of 40 minutes, that nothing was exactly what he needed. He came back the next day, and the day after that. On the 5th visit, he wasn't alone. A woman in her mid-20s walked in ahead of him, scanning the cafe with the particular urgency of someone who'd been promised a place existed and needed to confirm it with her own eyes. She found Eli already settling onto his stool and stopped short, one hand pressed briefly to her mouth. "You're really here," she said, and Mara understood, before any introduction was made, that this was the sister. "Told you I would be?" Eli said, not quite meeting her eyes. "You've told me that 6 times in 8 months, and meant it maybe twice." But she said it gently, sliding onto the stool beside him, and when she turned to Mara, her expression carried something between gratitude and disbelief. "You're the sandwich woman." "Mara," Mara offered, extending a hand. "Priya." She held on to the handshake a beat longer than necessary. "I don't know what you did, but he answered my call yesterday. First time in 3 weeks. He initiated a text before that. I made my fiancé pull the car over so I could process it." "I didn't do much," Mara said, the same deflection she'd been offering everyone since the Humvees. "He did the rest." "He needed somewhere to do it from," Priya said, and there was an edge of old grief beneath the words. The accumulated exhaustion of loving someone through a silence you couldn't break from the outside. For 8 months there wasn't one. Now there apparently is, and it's a cafe with an Ohio-shaped coffee stain situation happening on your apron. Despite himself, Eli laughed, short, surprised, like the sound had caught him off guard as much as anyone else in the room. Mara realized, watching it happen, that she hadn't heard him laugh before. Not once, in 5 visits. It sounded like something rusty finding its hinges again. Priya didn't stay long. She had somewhere to be, she said, though the look she gave her brother suggested she'd have stayed all night if he'd asked her to. But she hugged Mara on the way out, quick and fierce, the kind of hug reserved for people who've done something too large to name properly in words. "Whatever this place is doing," she said at the door, "don't stop doing it." By the 2nd week, Eli had a seat. Not officially, nothing was announced, but everyone in the cafe understood the middle stool at the counter belonged to him between 4 and 6 in the evening, and nobody else sat there during those hours without an unspoken apology in their eyes. He started helping, in small ways, carrying crates from the delivery truck, fixing the flickering light above the corner table, which turned out to be a simple wiring issue he diagnosed in 10 minutes flat, a competence that seemed to surprise him as much as it surprised Mara. "You're good at that," she said, watching him screw the fixture back into place. "I was good at a lot of things," he said, then caught himself, like he'd said more than he meant. "Sorry, that sounded like something out of a movie." "It sounded honest," Mara said. "Those aren't always the same thing as dramatic." He looked at her then, really looked, in a way he hadn't allowed himself since the first night. "You don't flinch," he said. "Everyone else, my mom, my sister, they flinch when I get quiet, like they're waiting for something to go wrong. You don't do that." I grew up with someone who went quiet like you do, Mara said. She hadn't planned to say it, but it came out anyway, the way true things sometimes insist on being spoken. My father. He was a firefighter, pulled a family out of a house once, 3 kids, a mother, and lost the father in the same fire. He carried that his whole life, went quiet in the same way you do, flinched at sounds, sat near doors. Eli's hands stilled on the light fixture. Did he ever? He didn't finish the question, but she understood it anyway. He got better, Mara said carefully, and worse, and better again. It wasn't a straight line, but he didn't disappear. He just needed people who could sit in the quiet with him instead of trying to fill it. Eli nodded slowly, and for a long moment, neither of them said anything else. The exact kind of silence Mara had learned, years ago, not to be afraid of. The change didn't happen all at once. Growth rarely does. But by the 6th week, Eli was arriving before his shift at the counter even began, helping Denny prep vegetables, learning the rhythm of the cafe's mornings the way he'd once learned the rhythm of missions, methodically, thoroughly, like competence was a language he still remembered, even when words failed him elsewhere. General Kess visited again, this time without the fleet of Humvees, just her own car, and a bouquet of flowers she seemed almost embarrassed to be carrying. He mentioned you, she told Mara quietly, while Eli was in the back restocking. More than once. My son, who has said perhaps 400 words to me total in 8 months, mentions this cafe in every phone call now. He's doing the work, Mara said. I just make coffee. You make a place where he's allowed to be a person and not a case file, Kess said. Do you understand how rare that is for someone in his position? Everyone treats him like a wound that needs managing. You treat him like a man who fixes light fixtures. It was around then that Eli finally spoke the names. It happened on a slow Thursday evening, the cafe nearly empty, rain against the windows again, the same rain that had brought him in the first night, though neither of them mentioned that out loud. He was drying mugs behind the counter, and Mara was closing out the register, and the quiet between them had become the comfortable kind rather than the careful kind. Marcus, he said, without preamble, and Diego. Mara looked up, understanding immediately what he meant, and said nothing, because she'd learned by now that his sentences needed room to breathe before the next one arrived. Marcus had 2 kids. Diego was going to propose when he got back, had the ring in his gear the whole tour, showed it to me twice, like he needed someone else to confirm it was real. Eli's hands had stopped moving on the mug he was drying. I made the call that got one of them killed. Tactically, it was right. Everyone who reviewed it said so, but I still made it. I still chose. You didn't choose for them to die, Mara said quietly. You chose the option that gave your unit the best chance. That's not the same as choosing an outcome. I know that, he said. In my head, I know that. It just hasn't reached the rest of me yet. It will, she said. It's reaching you slower than you want. That doesn't mean it isn't reaching you. He set the mug down and looked at her, and for the first time since the night she'd paid for his dinner, his eyes weren't guarded. Why do you do this? He asked. Feed strangers. Let me sit here for weeks without asking anything in return. You could have just given me a sandwich once and moved on. Mara considered the question longer than she needed to, because the honest answer required unlocking something she didn't often discuss. My father died 2 years ago, she said, quietly, in his sleep, the way people who've survived loud things sometimes get to go. And in his last year, I finally understood that the thing that helped him most wasn't therapy, though that helped too. It was people who simply stayed, who didn't need him to perform being okay, who let him sit in a room without needing to fill the silence for their own comfort. She met Eli's eyes. I couldn't do that for him soon enough. I try to do it for whoever walks through that door instead. Eli was quiet for a long moment. Then, I'm glad it was you that night. Out of anyone it could have been. Me too, Mara said, and meant it entirely. The following week, he disappeared. Not permanently, but for 4 days, he didn't come to the counter, didn't answer Mara's texts, beyond a single line reading, needed some time, didn't pick up when General Kess called twice a day, with escalating worry she tried and failed to disguise as casual check-ins. Mara found out later what had triggered it. A name in a news segment, unrelated to his own unit, about a soldier killed in an operation overseas. 30 seconds of a broadcast, and it had unraveled 6 weeks of progress like a knot pulled loose. He'd gone back into his apartment and stopped answering the door, stopped eating regularly, sat with the television off and the blinds closed in a way his mother recognized, with a dread she didn't bother hiding when she showed up at the cafe on the 4th day, asking Mara if she'd go with her. "He won't let me in alone anymore," Kess admitted, standing in the cafe doorway with her composure fraying at the edges. "I don't know if it's you specifically, or if it's just someone who isn't trying to fix him, but I don't want to lose whatever ground we found." Mara went. She didn't bring food, didn't bring speeches, didn't bring anything except herself, and when Eli finally opened the door, unshaven, hollow-eyed, the corner table version of himself from the very first night, she didn't say anything about how worried everyone had been. "You don't have to talk," she said instead, stepping inside only when he moved aside to let her. "I can just sit." So she sat, in a small apartment that smelled like nobody had opened a window in days. And she didn't ask him what happened, or why, or how long this would last. 20 minutes passed in silence before he finally spoke. "I thought I was doing better," he said, voice rough from disuse. "4 days ago, I thought I was actually doing better, and then 30 seconds of a news story, and I'm right back at the bottom, like none of it counted." "It counted," Mara said. "This isn't the bottom. The bottom was 8 months of nobody being able to reach you at all. This is a bad 4 days, inside a much longer stretch of better ones. Those aren't the same thing, even when they feel identical from the inside." He didn't answer right away, but 2 days later, he came back to the cafe, quieter than before, moving like something in him was still bruised, but there. Mara didn't make it a milestone. She just poured his coffee the way she always had, and let the corner table hold him again until he was ready for the counter. 3 months after the first Humvee parked outside the Blue Sparrow Café, Eli attended his sister's wedding. He told Mara about it the week before, in the same halting, careful way he told her most things now. Not confession exactly, but a kind of testing, checking whether the words held weight when spoken aloud to someone who wouldn't flinch. "I'm going to try the whole thing this time," he said. "Not just the ceremony, the dinner too, the dancing." He paused. "I might leave early. I want you to know that in advance, in case I do." "You don't owe me a report," Mara said, sliding a coffee toward him. "Go. Leave early if you need to. Staying the whole time isn't the win. Trying is." He went, in a dress uniform he hadn't worn since the funeral he refused to think about, standing at the back of a church he used to know every inch of as a boy. He made it through the ceremony by counting his sister's steps down the aisle, a trick Mara had suggested. Give the mind something small and specific to hold on to when the whole scene threatens to become too large. He made it through the dinner by sitting near the exit, the same instinct that had once kept him alive, now simply keeping him comfortable, and nobody at the table asked him to explain why. It was during the first dance that something nearly broke. The band was louder than the reception hall's small size should have allowed, and halfway through the song, a champagne glass shattered somewhere near the bar. Sharp, sudden, entirely ordinary, and Eli's whole body went rigid, his chair scraping back an inch before he caught himself. His sister, mid-dance, saw it happen from across the room. She didn't stop dancing. She didn't call attention to it. She simply caught his eye and gave the smallest nod, the kind two people share when they've grown up understanding each other without needing words, and it was enough to let him breathe again. He left early, not from the dinner, but partway through the dancing, when the music got loud enough to blur into something his body still associated with danger. But he stayed for the ceremony, and the toasts, and his sister's first dance, and when General Kess called Mara 2 days later, not to report an emergency this time, just to talk. Her voice carried something Mara hadn't heard in it before. He danced with his sister, Kess said, just for a minute, just the first 30 seconds of the song before it got too loud. But he did it. He hasn't danced with anyone since before his second deployment. That's enormous, Mara said. It is, Kess agreed. And it started with a sandwich. Eli's progress continued to be imperfect. Some weeks better, some weeks quieter again. The non-linear shape of real healing that Mara had learned, from her father, not to mistake for failure. He started attending therapy consistently rather than merely showing up. He began speaking Marcus and Diego's names to his mother, then to his sister, then finally, months later, to their families, in a series of letters he wrote and rewrote a dozen times before sending. He kept coming to the cafe. Eventually he asked Mara if the position could be official, not charity work, not a project, but an actual job, something with a schedule and a paycheck, and a reason to show up that had nothing to do with being fixed. "I'm good with my hands," he said. "I fix things. I used to fix vehicles in the field, believe it or not. I could fix this place's espresso machine before it becomes a permanent seance." Mara laughed. The first time she'd laughed at something he'd said, rather than something gentle passing between them. "You're hired," she said, "assuming you can handle Denny's music." "I can handle a lot more than Denny's music," Eli said, and there was something in his voice now that hadn't been there the first night. Not confidence exactly, not yet, but the early shape of it, the foundation a person builds on before they're ready to call it that out loud. A year after the first night, the Blue Sparrow Café had a new addition, a small plaque beside the corner table, the one under what used to be a flickering light, now steady and warm. It read simply, "Reserved for whoever needs it most tonight." Nobody enforced the reservation. Nobody had to. Regulars understood, without being told, that the table stayed open for anyone who walked in carrying something heavier than they could say out loud. A policy Eli had suggested, quietly, one evening while restocking napkins. "Someone did it for me without a plaque," he'd said, "but maybe the sign helps people know it's allowed." General Kess visited every few weeks now, always in her own car, always without a fleet, always staying long enough to have a full cup of coffee and watch her son work a counter with the kind of ease she'd once feared she'd never see again. She and Mara had become something like friends, an unlikely pairing, a career general and a cafe owner, bonded by the same 8 months that had nearly broken one family and quietly repaired it instead. Mara still didn't know, most nights, why she'd paid for that first dinner. It hadn't felt like a decision so much as a reflex, built from a father's silences she'd spent a lifetime learning to read. But she understood now what General Kess had tried to tell her that first chaotic morning, surrounded by Humvees and soldiers, and a fear that had turned out to be nothing but a mother's love overflowing its careful banks. Some rescues don't arrive with sirens. Some arrive quietly, on a rainy Tuesday, in the form of a stranger who simply decides that someone eating alone deserves not to be alone in that moment, and who has no idea, sliding a check away with 2 words, "It's covered," that she has just become the first solid ground beneath a man who'd been falling, silently, for 8 months. The light above the corner table stayed on every night the cafe was open. It never flickered again.
Here's what stays with me about this one. Mara didn't know she was saving anyone. She just saw a stranger eating alone, carrying something heavy behind his eyes, and she made a choice most of us make 100 times a day without thinking twice. She chose kindness over convenience. That's it. That's the whole beginning of this story. No sirens, no headlines, just a sandwich, and a woman who decided a stranger's dignity mattered more than a few dollars off her register. And somehow, that one quiet decision reached further than she could have imagined. So here's my question for you. When's the last time you did something kind with absolutely nothing to gain from it? Tell me in the comments. I read every single one. And if this story moved you even a little, hit subscribe. There's another one waiting for you, and trust me, you don't want to miss it. See you in the next story.